This historical video is the first in a series of videos on the San Bernardino Mountains that are currently being produced, which will explore the gold rush days, cattle ranching, and the logging industry that first brought people in significant numbers to these mountains. Guided tours of the original grand lodges and resorts that became playgrounds for some fascinating people, both the famous and the notorious, along with a fascinating behind-the-scenes look at a few of the hundreds of movies that were filmed throughout these mountains. Learn about the fights and the controversies surrounding the construction of the dams at Big Bear and Lake Arrowhead, which created the lakes, and the struggle to popularize skiing and winter sports, which eventually turned the San Bernardinos into a year-round resort. The San Bernardino Mountains, from Lake Arrowhead to Big Bear Lake, is Southern California's four-season recreation area. Literally millions of people travel through these mountains every year looking for fun and relaxation. But in the 1800s, to settlers migrating to Southern California, these mountains presented an unacceptable obstacle to their travel from the east to the west coast. It was the discovery of gold and lumber which actually brought significant number of peoples into these mountains. We'd like to take you back now to show you what it was like before the ski resorts, before the lakes were formed. Our story starts here, at the west end of the San Bernardino Mountains on Highway 18, near the Crestline turnoff. It was in 1851 when a wagon train from Salt Lake City, made up of 500 Mormons, arrived at the base of this mountain and established a small community they called San Bernardino. When they looked up to these slopes to the tops of these mountains, it wasn't because they wanted to go snow skiing or camping. They needed lumber. So, by hand, they cut a road up the incredibly steep Waterman Canyon and set up the first sawmill in the San Bernardino Mountains.
Charles Chrisman built the first sawmill in the west end of the mountain range. When he had come down with the Mormon wagon train, at Salt Springs there was an abandoned stamp mill. The Indians had raided this mill and killed the people, so it was in dangerous territory. But Chrisman and his son got a wagon and went out there and loaded the steam engine and the boiler and brought it back to San Bernardino Valley and installed it, and it became the first sawmill in this mountain range.
By July of 1853, the first wagon loads of cut lumber from the Chrisman sawmill were making their way to San Bernardino. Then, in 1857, word came from the church leader Brigham Young recalling the Mormons to Salt Lake. In spite of all the energy and money invested, most of the Mormon group sold their businesses and homes at a loss and returned to Utah. This monument has been erected to acknowledge those early Mormon pioneers who built that first road into these mountains. New sawmills quickly spread eastward across the mountaintops toward Little Bear Valley, now Lake Arrowhead. The rapid growth of San Bernardino and Los Angeles created an unlimited demand for lumber. One of the largest mills was built by Francis L. Talmadge.
A very prominent early sawmill family was the LeBaron Talmadge family, and they settled in what now is the bottom of Lake Arrowhead. Talmadge built a very large sawmill there, and during the time they were there, he had 3 sons born, Frank, Will, and John. These later played a very important part in Bear Valley history because they opened cattle ranching in this valley extensively.
Talmadge originally had helped William Cayley build the Cayley sawmill near an area now known as Blue Jay in 1865. In 1867, he then went on to build his own sawmill and cattle ranch in the lush green meadows of Little Bear Valley that is now the bottom of Lake Arrowhead. It was recorded during the early 1880s that Talmadge and other operators such as LaProix, Cayley, and the Tyler brothers were hauling a combined total of 4 to 6 million board feet of lumber out of the San Bernardino Mountains each year. About a mile below Running Springs on Highway 18, the largest and most controversial sawmill to operate in the San Bernardino Mountains came into existence. It was in the late 1800s when a Michigan-based corporation headed up by John E. Brookings purchased all the holdings of the Highland Lumber Company that was operating in this area. The company immediately began turning the sawmill into the largest and most sophisticated operation in the mountains. The mill was upgraded with the latest circular and bandsaws. About 200 men were hired at $1.75 per day. They built a railroad to haul cut logs to the mill. Locomotives and flat cars were dragged up the new City Creek Toll Road, now Highway 330, all the way to the mill just below Running Springs. Between 1901 and 1911, the Brookings Company was delivering about 10 million board feet of lumber per year.
Well, there have been many logging companies in the west part of this range, but the Brookings Lumber Company was by far the biggest and the largest and lasted the longest. Their operation was so extensive that over 32 miles of narrow gauge railroad was built as far west as Heaps Peak, and also came as far this way as a place called Lightningdale, which is near Green Valley Lake. There's some people say that the railroad actually got into Green Valley Lake, but it didn't get that close to Big Bear. The Brookings operation employed around 180 people, and it was almost a year-round operation except during very heavy weather.
The company had lumber rights to cover 6,000 acres of mountain timber. The unregulated clear-cut methods of logging used at the time completely stripped the watershed from large areas of the mountain. In one of the earliest conservation movements, San Bernardino Valley residents got involved. They lobbied to save what was left of the timberland and forced replanting the areas that had been cut. The Forest Service stepped in and increased its control and established new regulations. Frustrated, the Brookings Lumber Company dismantled its operations and moved to Oregon in 1912. San Bernardino County eventually took over the Brookings Railroad right-of-way and turned it into part of the Rim of the World Drive between Running Springs and Lake Arrowhead. The Brookings Company marked the end of large-scale lumbering in the San Bernardino Mountains. About the same time the logging industry was taking off on the west end of the San Bernardino Mountains, a gold rush was started on the east end near Big Bear Lake. Credit for this gold rush is given to a man named Bill Holcomb. As the story goes, it was in the spring of 1860. Holcomb had been prospecting for gold in the Big Bear Valley. After a long winter, he hiked up Van Duzen Canyon while hunting for bear. Upon crossing over the ridge, he discovered gold in a lush green valley that would eventually bear his name. Within 2 months, word of Holcomb's discovery got out, and miners from all over invaded Holcomb's Valley. By September, a small settlement called Belleville with over 1,000 men literally popped into existence. At the same time, in other parts of Holcomb Valley, Clapboard Town and Uniontown went up almost overnight.
The population grew so fast that the residents of Holcomb Valley soon outnumbered the entire San Bernardino County. As a matter of fact, in the elections of 1860 to determine the location of the new county seat, the city of San Bernardino barely beat out Belleville for that honor by just 2 votes.
There was indeed a lot of problems between the miners in the north and south. As a matter of fact, the population of Holcomb Valley was dominated by the southern faction. The major towns were Belleville, which was the largest. The next largest was Clapboard Town, and then there was a town called Union Flat that was prominent. These names, such as Union Flat and John Bull Flat, which is the mountain north of Holcomb, reflect that period of time during the Civil War.
But within the first year, excitement began to subside with the realization that placer mining was not producing gold in profitable amounts. By the end of the second year, most miners had given up and gone elsewhere. 15 years later, San Francisco multimillionaire Elias J. Lucky Baldwin started another gold rush when he constructed a large 40-stamp mill at the base of Gold Mountain in 1874. By the time his stamp mill roared to life in March of 1875, a new mining town called Bardstown, with 2 saloons, a butcher shop, and 2 boarding houses had sprung into existence at the northeast end of Baldwin Lake.
However, the amount of gold recovered from Lucky Baldwin's Gold Mountain mines fell well below expectations. and a disappointed Lucky Baldwin shut the mill down after only 7 months of operations. Bardstown quickly became a ghost town until August of 1876, when it mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground. Lucky Baldwin swore that he would never invest another dime in his Gold Mountain mines.
Then in 1899, Baldwin struck a deal with a man named Captain J.R. Delamar to build a new 40-stamp mill on the hill above the original Baldwin mill. Delamar wanted to use a new cyanide process that would dramatically increase the amount of gold recovered from low-grade ore. By September of 1900, the new stamp mill was running at full capacity and recovering over $4,000 a week in gold. It wasn't the mother lode he was looking for, but it paid the bills and even showed a modest profit. In 1903, Delamar shut down the mill.
The stamp mill is nothing more than a giant hammer that crushes ore into a fine powder. It is operated by the camshaft, which lifts the stems, which are attached to the heads, and the heads fall on the shoes with terrific impact, crushing the rock into a fine powder.
One of the more interesting big money ideas to extract gold from this area was attempted by a London-based company. In 1894, the Valley Gold Company Limited spent a fortune hauling a railroad steam shovel up the mountains into Holcomb Valley and dug a 16-foot wide, 8-foot deep trench over a half-mile long across the valley floor looking for gold. The attempt was a failure, and operations were suspended a year later in 1895. The real pay dirt in the San Bernardino Mountains was found in a place called Round Valley, just east of Big Bear Valley. Originally filed as the Homestake Mine in 1887, it eventually became known as the Rose Mine. Between 1898 and 1906, its operators consistently recovered as much as 100 times more gold per ton of ore mined than Lucky Baldwin's much-publicized Gold Mountain. The Rose Mine has since been designated as a historical site by the U.S. Forest Service. By the early 1880s, the gold boom was over. Cattle and sheep ranching was the main big business in Big Bear. Ranchers such as Metcalf, Smart, Knight, and others grazed cattle in the green meadows of Bear Valley, which had some of the best grazing land in Southern California. On a cold spring morning in 1883, with fresh snow still on the ground, Frank Elwood Brown rode into the valley looking for a reliable source of water for Redlands citrus farmers.
As he explored the valley, he knew his search was over. He returned to Redlands and organized a group of wealthy Redlands farmers to back him. He formed the Bear Valley Land and Water Company and began immediately buying up land and water rights in the valley. Because of financial considerations, a single-arch rock dam was to be built instead of the conventional gravity dam. Construction began in July.
Granite blocks weighing 2 to 3 tons each would be cut from the surrounding hillsides to be used as construction material.
Italian masons were imported to hand cut these big blocks of granite. There was a method called plug and feather, and they would hand drill a row of holes, and they would put the feathers in and then split the rock by driving the plug in. These were transported to the site on the west shore by cable, and then they were put on a barge and floated out to the dam. And the water level in the lake was allowed to rise as the dam increased in height, so that the blocks were pretty much in position without having to use cranes to lift them.
Today, there is still evidence of the work that went into splitting the giant rocks. Hiking among the boulders on the southwest side of the lake, we find many rocks with boreholes that were painstakingly drilled out by hand without the use of explosives or heavy equipment. The winter snows of 1883 brought construction to a halt. In June of 1884, work commenced again, and by that November, the dam reached its final height of 52 feet. The rock dam was only 20 feet wide at the bottom and